All right, let's dive into another deep dive. This one, it's going to be pretty fascinating and maybe a little unsettling. Today we're looking into Chris Butler
Okay.
and the Science of Identity Foundation.
All right.
Now, you might also know them by
Okay.
SIF or Iwaku or even Czaitanii Mission.
Wow. That's a lot of names for one organization.
Yeah.
Makes you think there's a lot to unpack here.
You got that right. We've got Facebook posts, we've got forum discussions, we've
Okay.
got articles. One's even called The Wolf Wore Sheep's Clothing several times.
Oh, wow.
Even stuff from different websites, and some of it's
Yeah.
even in different languages. It's a whole thing.
It really shows how widespread this story is,
Yeah.
touching different communities and lives. It'll be interesting to see how it all fits together.
Definitely. So, where do we even start with a guy like Chris Butler?
Well, we've got to talk about A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada.
Okay.
Chris Butler was actually one of his students.
Right.
But he ended up leaving ISKCon in the early 70s.
Yeah, and it seems like he had a pretty interesting path even before that. The sources mention that he was teaching Kundalini yoga in Hawaii,
Oh, wow.
and then he shifts over to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I mean, isn't that kind of a big jump?
It is. It really makes you think about how that earlier experience could have affected his later teachings.
Right.
And how he formed SIF.
Yeah.
I mean, Kundalini Yoga and Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Right.
they're really different traditions, different practices, different philosophies.
I see what you mean. It's like he was trying to mix different spiritual paths together. And speaking of mixing things up, there's that whole thing about his early life in Hawaii. Like, the sources say he was living the simple life, Okay. almost like, an ascetic. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's co-founding Down to Earth, this successful health food store chain.
That's quite a change. Shows his ability to adapt and connect with people,
Yeah,
which is important when we talk about SIF.
absolutely. It's like he had this natural charisma and, he was business savvy, which helped him build a following both in a spiritual sense
Yeah.
and commercially, too. And speaking of SIF, the sources describe it as this unique blend of Gaudiya Vaishnavism
Okay.
and political goals, maybe with some influence from that Kundalini yoga background we were talking about.
Right, and that's where things get interesting
Yeah.
with SIF, which they called independence for godly government at first. You can see he's going for this fusion of spirituality and politics.
Which, that's a powerful mix. Could be used for good or for bad, depending on, what the goal is.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's that huge controversy about him breaking his sannyasa vows
Oh, right.
and marrying Wailana, who, was the wife of one of his disciples.
Yeah, Richard Bellord.
Yeah, Richard Bellord.
That decision really shocked the Gaudiya Vaishnava community. Raises questions about whether he was really following traditional principles.
It's definitely a turning point in his story.
Definitely.
Makes you wonder what his motivations were and, what direction he was taking SIF in. But it feels like that's just the beginning. The deeper we dig, the more disturbing these allegations about SIF become.
Yeah, we've got those allegations of cult practices, abuse, even some strange rituals.
Huh.
It's going to get uncomfortable,
Right.
but we have to go through it all.
Definitely. Let's not shy away from it. So let's start with the money side of things.
Okay.
What kind of exploitation are we talking about?
Basically, followers were pressured to give up a lot of money.
Okay.
We're talking donations, fines for little things. They even wanted patents,
Wow.
copyrights, even whole businesses.
That's a lot. Makes you wonder, where was all that money going?
Yeah.
And what was it being used for? Was it actually helping the followers?
That's a good question. And maybe looking into the claims about psychological manipulation could help us understand
Right.
the hold Butler seemed to have over everyone.
Okay, let's get into that.
Right.
What kind of tactics are we talking about here?
Well, former members say Butler would really emphasize their flaws, their sinfulness, saying they needed his guidance to reach salvation. Almost like he was the only one with the truth.
Yeah.
The only way to enlightenment.
It's like that whole guru thing, right?
Yeah.
Saying only he has the knowledge.
Exactly. And he demanded complete obedience.
Yeah.
Total loyalty. Any doubts about his teachings, you'd face consequences.
That's intense. And you mentioned manipulation. How did that actually play out in people's lives?
Butler was constantly telling his followers they were sinful,
Okay.
dependent on him. So they felt worthless without him, always looking for his approval, afraid of his judgment.
It's like he made them spiritually dependent on him. And the sources mention punishments,
Yeah.
fines
Mm-hmm.
for the smallest things.
Imagine getting fined because a meal wasn't cooked right. It's almost like you had to pay to save your soul.
That's a pretty strong way to put it. But it really shows how this kind of manipulation, where it preys on people's fears and their desire for spiritual growth. Butler demanded all this devotion,
Right.
but what was he actually giving back? Was it just the promise of enlightenment, or was it something more?
Good question. Was he really looking out for his followers, or was something else driving him? Those claims about financial exploitation make you wonder.
It seems like we keep coming back to those claims.
We do.
It's clear that money is a big part of the Sif story.
It is.
But let's switch gears a bit. Let's go back to Butler's views on traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava principles.
Okay.
That whole back and forth with the Gaudiya math.
Yeah.
It's still so confusing how he can have such contradictory views.
It really is a puzzle. He's criticizing them publicly,
Yeah.
even saying his own guru, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, might not be legitimate. But then he tells his followers they could join the Gaudiya math if they believe in an appointed acharya.
Wait, so he's putting them down but also saying they're a valid path.
Yeah. Makes you wonder what he was trying to do.
Yeah. It's like a mixed message. It makes you question his intentions.
For sure.
So was he trying to make people distrust the Gaudiya math? Or was something else going on?
Hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
Just adds another layer of mystery to all of this.
And speaking of mysteries, we can't forget about Tulsi Gabbard
Right.
and her connection to Sif.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if her being involved ever worried her voters.
That's a great question. Did her ties to Sif affect her political choices?
Yeah.
Her stance on certain issues? We might need to look into that more.
Like in news articles or interviews with Gabbard herself?
Exactly.
Well, there's still more to find out. It makes this deep dive feel like a real investigation,
It does.
where we, the listeners, have to uncover the truth ourselves.
That's right. We're not giving you all the answers.
Yeah.
We're giving you the tools to figure it out on your own.
And we've already found out so much, even with just a quick look. We've got controversial teachings,
Right.
potential abuse,
Yeah.
questionable financial stuff going on. It's a lot to take in.
It is. We need to look at all this with a critical eye. These are big accusations.
Right.
But we have to consider all sides of the story.
I agree. But at the same time, these former members keep telling the same stories. And they're serious accusations. It makes you think that Sif might have been more concerned with power and control than the well-being of its members.
That's a key takeaway here.
Definitely.
It reminds us to be careful when we're looking at spiritual groups or leaders.
Absolutely.
Question everything, trust your gut.
I love that. It's easy to get caught up in the promise of enlightenment.
It is.
But we have to look beyond the surface and really think about the practices and motivations of these organizations. Speaking of looking deeper, there's this idea of sahajiya that I think we need to explore. It seems connected to Chris Butler and Sif somehow.
You're right, it is relevant. Sahajiya can mean a few things, but in Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Right.
it often describes people or groups that break away from tradition.
So it's like not conforming to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Can you give us some examples?
Sure, one example would be incorporating practices from other traditions,
Okay.
especially things Gaudiya Vaishnavism considers unorthodox or taboo.
Like Butler's background in Kundalini yoga?
Exactly. He reinterpreted some core ideas too,
Uh-huh.
like the guru's role and spiritual surrender to fit his own teachings
Right.
and his leadership style.
So Sahaja helps us understand Butler and Saiv.
Yeah. By calling someone Sahajiya, Gaudiya Vaishnava authorities basically say their teachings aren't legitimate. It's a way to discredit them and warn others.
So they're protecting the tradition and their followers from harmful teachings.
You could say that. For Butler, being labeled a Sahajiya discredited him within traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, a warning sign for potential followers.
It all makes sense now. Butler's Kundalini yoga background, his teachings, his practices, they all make him seem like a deviant within Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
And that's made even stronger by his opposition to the Gaudiya math
Yeah.
and his criticism of their leaders. It's almost as if he wanted to be this rebel,
Okay.
challenging the established order, appealing to people disillusioned with traditional religion.
Like a spiritual counterculture?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's important to consider. Some people see Butler's teachings as dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
manipulative,
Right.
while others find them liberating. It depends on your perspective.
So it all comes back to thinking critically,
It does.
making your own judgments.
We've given you a lot of information,
Mm-hmm.
good and bad. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you believe.
That's what I like about this. It gives the listener the power to choose.
Exactly. We're not telling you what to think. We're giving you the tools to form your own opinions.
It's been quite a journey so far.
It has.
From the beaches of Hawaii to drug smuggling rings and allegations of abuse.
And there's still more to come. Lots more to unpack.
So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. All right, we're back and ready to keep digging into this whole Chris Butler and Science of Identity Foundation situation. Last time things got, well...
intense.
Yeah, intense is one word for it. We were talking about drug smuggling and, weird rituals. And even possible political connections.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
Yeah.
But it all comes back to how Butler ran Ceph and how he influenced his followers.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. Like, how did he actually manage to keep so much control over Ceph? The sources talk about his leadership style, and it seems like he mixed spiritual authority with, like, psychological manipulation.
It's fascinating how he used both of those to create this unquestionable authority within Ceph. He presented himself as, like, this infallible figure, almost divine, like he had the only key to enlightenment.
That classic guru persona, right?
Exactly. And to make that image stronger, he demanded total obedience, unquestioning loyalty. If you even questioned his teachings, there were consequences, sometimes harsh ones.
Sounds like a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
You mentioned the psychological manipulation. Like, how did that play out day to day for Ceph members?
Well, Butler would constantly focus on their flaws, their sinfulness. He'd tell them they were completely dependent on him to overcome those things. It made them feel like they were nothing without him.
So it created this system of, like, spiritual dependence on him.
Exactly. And the sources talk about punishments, fines for the tiniest things.
It was all part of this, like, culture of fear and self-doubt, wasn't it?
It was. Imagine getting fined for, like, I don't know, a meal not being cooked right.
Oh, wow.
It was like, pay up or risk your soul.
That's a powerful way to put it. It really shows how manipulation preys on people's fears and their, longing for spiritual growth. Butler demanded all this devotion, but was he actually giving anything back? Was it just, like, the promise of enlightenment, or was it something else entirely?
That's the question, isn't it? Was he actually concerned about them, or was it something else?
Yeah.
The financial exploitation claims definitely make you wonder.
We keep coming back to that.
We do.
Money seems to be a really important part of the Ceph story.
Definitely.
But let's shift gears a bit. Let's go back to Butler's stance on traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava beliefs.
Okay.
The whole back and forth with the Gaudiya math.
Yeah, it's still confusing how he could have such opposing views.
It is. He's out there criticizing them, even questioning his own guru, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada.
I know.
But then he's also saying that his followers could join the Gaudiya math if they believe in an appointed acharya. It's like, what?
It's like he's trying to discredit them,
right,
but also acknowledge them as a valid path. It's a strange strategy.
So was he just trying to create confusion about the Gaudiya math? Or was there something else going on?
Hard to say for sure. It's another piece of the puzzle.
It is. And speaking of puzzles, we can't forget about Tulsi Gabbard.
Right, her connection to Ceph.
Do you think her involvement ever raised eyebrows, like, among other politicians?
That's a good question. Did being part of Ceph influence her political decisions? We should look into that.
Maybe there's more information in, like, news articles or interviews with her?
Possibly. There's always more to uncover.
I like that. It turns this deep dive into a real investigation.
It does.
Where we, the listeners, have to find the missing pieces.
We're just giving you the tools to do it.
And even just scratching the surface, we've uncovered a lot.
We have.
Controversial teachings, potential abuse, all those financial questions. It's a lot.
It is. And it's important to be critical about all of this.
Right.
These are serious accusations.
Yeah.
We have to look at the whole picture.
I agree. But it's hard to ignore all these stories from former members. They keep saying the same things. It makes you wonder if Ceph was more focused on power and control than taking care of its members.
That's a key takeaway here.
It is.
A reminder to be careful when you're looking at spiritual groups or leaders. Question everything. Trust your gut.
That's such good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the promise of, like, enlightenment.
It really is.
But we have to look deeper. We have to think about what these groups are really doing and why.
Absolutely.
Speaking of looking deeper, there's this concept of Sahaja.
Oh, okay.
I'm really curious about it. It seems connected to Chris Butler and Ceph.
It is. Sahaja can mean a few things.
Okay.
But in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, it often refers to people or groups that stray from traditional principles.
So they're not conforming to Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Right. Like incorporating practices from other traditions, things Gaudiya Vaishnavism might consider taboo.
Like Butler's background with Kundalini yoga.
Exactly. And he reinterpreted some core concepts
Yeah.
to fit his own ideas,
Huh.
like the role of the guru and what spiritual surrender means.
So Sahajiya is a way to understand Butler and Seth.
It is. It's how Gaudiya Vaishnava authorities basically say these teachings aren't legitimate. It's a way to discredit them and warn potential followers.
So they're protecting the tradition
Right, yeah.
and their followers
Yeah.
from harmful teachings. It's starting to make sense now.
Good.
Butler's Kundalini yoga background, his teachings, his practices, they all paint him as this deviant in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Yeah, and that's made stronger by his opposition to the Gaudiya math,
Mm-hmm.
his criticism of their leaders. He almost seemed to want to be a rebel,
Okay.
challenging the system, attracting people who were disillusioned with traditional religion.
Like a spiritual counterculture.
Exactly. And that's important. Some might see Butler's teachings as dangerous and manipulative,
Mm-hmm.
but others might find them liberating and empowering. It all comes down to your own perspective.
So it all comes back to critical thinking and making your own judgments.
It always does.
We've given you all this information,
Mhm.
good and bad.
Yeah,
But in the end, you have to decide what you believe.
we're just giving you the tools.
And it's been quite a journey.
It has.
From Hawaii to drug smuggling to allegations of abuse, we've covered a lot.
We have, and there's still more to explore.
Right. So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. It's been, I don't know about you,
Yep.
but it's been a wild ride for me.
It really has. Fascinating. From those early days in Hawaii
Mm-hmm.
to, all the complexities of his teachings and the controversies with Sif.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about.
There is.
But one thing keeps coming up, those allegations about Sif operating like a cult.
Right. That's a serious accusation. Needs
Yeah,
careful
like-
examination.
It does, and cult is like such a loaded word, right?
It is very subjective.
So how do we even approach this responsibly? What are we looking for when we consider these allegations?
Those firsthand accounts from foreign members are crucial here.
Right.
They give us a glimpse into what was going on inside Sif.
Okay, so let's dive into those accounts. What are some of the things that come up over and over?
One thing you see a lot is this complete devotion to Chris Butler. He's the only spiritual authority. He was seen as infallible, and if you questioned his teachings, well, you'd face consequences.
That sounds familiar. We talked about how he used manipulation to, create that dependence.
Exactly. That kind of devotion to the leader, that's a red flag.
Right.
It stops people from thinking critically and speaking out.
And what about the financial side of things?
Right. We've heard some pretty disturbing stuff about financial exploitation within Sef.
Yeah, former members talked about being pressured to donate large sums of money, sometimes even their entire inheritances
It's true.
or business assets.
Raises some ethical questions, for sure. How was that money being used? Was it really benefiting the followers?
Sounds like they were taking advantage of people's faith
Yeah.
and their desire for spiritual growth.
A troubling pattern, definitely. And then there's the isolation factor. Lots of cults try to cut members off from the outside world.
Right, so they become dependent on the group.
Exactly. Did you see any evidence of that in the sources?
Well, it doesn't seem like Seth completely isolated members,
Okay.
but the sources do suggest that they discouraged close relationships outside of Seth,
Right.
and they didn't like it when people questioned things.
It's a more subtle kind of isolation, but still effective in controlling what information people get.
Right, and then there are those allegations of abuse within Seth,
Mhm.
emotional and physical.
It's hard to hear, but former members have talked about verbal abuse,
Mhm.
humiliation, even physical intimidation by Butler and his inner circle.
It's a reminder that power can be used in some really dark ways.
It is. And it's important to remember that this kind of abuse isn't limited to Sif.
Right.
This cult-like behavior, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, like in religious groups or even self-help seminars.
Exactly.
Mhm.
It's a reminder to be careful. Always think critically when someone claims to have all the answers, whether it's about spirituality,
Mhm.
emotions,
Yeah.
or even finances.
We should always question those who demand total obedience
Yeah.
or who offer simple solutions to complicated problems.
Trust your gut. If something feels wrong
Right.
or too good to be true, it probably is.
Great advice. And that brings us to something really important in this deep dive.
Okay.
Individual discernment.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we've looked at a lot of information about Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation,
We have.
good and bad, the teachings, the controversies, the abuse allegations, but it's up to each person to decide what they believe
Right, right.
and how they want to use this information.
It's about empowering the listener.
Exactly. To make their own choices
Hmm.
and realize that there's not one right answer when it comes to spirituality.
Exactly. We're not here to tell you what to think.
Right.
We're giving you the tools to form your own opinions.
It's definitely been a challenging journey, full of twists and turns and, some uncomfortable truths.
But eye-opening, too.
Definitely. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to think critically. Question everything. Challenge authority. Get different perspectives.
And never be afraid to trust your gut, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality. Your journey is your own.
Absolutely. You have the power to choose the path that feels right for you.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
It's been quite a ride.
It has. Wouldn't have missed it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.